Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Lon Schiffbauer, and today we are going to talk about the ethical, legal, and regulatory climate we can expect to find when we start doing business internationally. So let's jump right in. So, the first thing I want to do is talk about ethics. Now, once again, ethics tends to be one of those words that we know what ethics means, and we can use ethics in a sentence. But if we're really pressed to define ethics, well, that's another matter. So let's define ethics. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you a dictionary definition to start with, but then we'll dig deeper. So, ethics are the standards of behavior. Ethics has everything to do with behavior and establishing standards of behavior. Okay? Standards of behavior that tell us how human beings ought to act in the many situations in which they find themselves. So, we are friends, parents, children, citizens, business people, teachers, students, professionals, so on. We find ourselves in many, many situations based on the roles and responsibilities that we have in this world. And those roles and responsibilities come with certain standards of behavior. Okay? So it's not what you feel is right. It's not your personal values. We're not talking religious morals, laws, or culturally accepted norms. This is something different. I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way, and we will compare ethics with some other principles. So let's start with a personal value. A personal value is exactly that. It's a general guiding principle that you as an individual hold as something important. So, for example, we might say, I always try to tell the truth. That's a personal value. Now, compare that with a moral. A moral is a value that has been codified by the community. The idea is that the community writ large has decided that, you know what, we are going to function better as a community as we cooperate and collaborate together for the benefit of one another if we all agree to adopt this value. And so we codify it. Codify means really kind of putting it into, well, writing it in stone in the Judeo-Christian sense, right? Thou shalt not bear false witness is an example of codifying, in this case, a religious moral for the community. Now, morals tend to exhibit themselves in religious settings, but that's not the only place, okay? All right, well then, what about a law? A law is when we have a behavior that can be enforced with consequences. Now, if I have as a personal value, I always try to tell the truth, well, there's no external body to enforce that or inflict consequences upon me if I do not tell the truth. So we put in place laws, and we have laws regarding libel, slander, and perjury. These are all laws that basically encourage us to tell the truth and to be truthful in all of our dealings. Okay, so then what is an ethic? An ethic is the best thing to do given the circumstances. So, for example, as a parent, I might tell my child, yes, there is a Santa Claus. Well, now, hold on. I've already said I always try to tell the truth. And spoiler alert, there is no Santa Claus. I've borne false witness because I say that I know that Santa exists when I know that he doesn't. Therefore, I've borne false witness. And I have a special relationship of trust with my child. Therefore, I've really perjured myself before him, right? So why would telling a child that there is a Santa Claus be considered an ethical decision? Well, now, maybe it's not. Here's one of the things about ethics is ethics are all about ethical dilemmas. You're between a rock and a hard place. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so, as a parent raising a child in the United States, which is a Judeo Christian society, and Santa Claus being such a prominent figure during the Christmas season, I'm in a tight spot. I need to decide whether or not to allow my child this fantasy and this sort of, mystical fiction of this man in red who comes and brings gifts, or I need to tell the kid from 3 years old, no, 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 all your friends are being lied to. There is no Santa. Deal with it. I chose to go the route of saying there's a Santa Claus. And I can accept that as an ethical decision for myself as a parent. Okay. Well, of course, we're not sitting here talking about Santa Claus. We're here talking about international business. Now, there are a lot of ethical philosophies and approaches that we can consider when it comes to international business. What I want to do is talk about 4 approaches that tend to be rather common, but in and of themselves are not complete. In and of themselves, they are incomplete. And that's why we call them strawmen, all right? Strawmen, all of these approaches have some inherent value, but are unsatisfactory in important ways in and of themselves, which means you really kind of need to think about what your ethical approach will be. We'll talk about that. All right. So let's first talk about the Friedman Doctrine. The Friedman Doctrine is the brainchild of Milton Friedman, an American Pulitzer Prize winning economist who is no slouch, folks. All right. When you're a Pulitzer Prize winning economist, you know your stuff, and he knows his stuff. That said, the Friedman Doctrine alone does not help us really guide our ethical decision. His doctrine is the only social responsibility a company has is to increase its profits for shareholders within the boundaries of the law. Okay? So there's only one social responsibility: use the resources to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in no deception or fraud. Okay, now this makes sense, right? However, a company, especially when doing business internationally, has more obligation, more corporate responsibility to simply its shareholders. It has a corporate responsibility to the host country, to the people, to the environment, to employment practices. We're going to talk about these. It is not enough to simply say, so long as we are making money for our shareholders, we are behaving ethically. It doesn't quite work like that, especially when working overseas. You have to look after the host country's concerns as well, because you're a guest. All right. Next one is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism basically says ethics are determined by the culture, so companies should adopt the ethics of the culture in which they operate. So kind of when in Rome. Well, cultural relativism fails to recognize that ethics are not culturally grounded. That's one of the things that makes ethics difficult to kind of put your finger on, all right? Otherwise, if ethics are culturally grounded, we can say child labor is just fine in certain countries, but not in others. We can say that bribes are fine in some countries, but not in others. Or we can say that using eminent domain for private gain is fine in some countries, but not others. No, ethics do not change when you cross a border. And cultural relativism kind of invites us to think that it does. We need to establish an ethical code by which we are going to do business and adhere to that no matter where we are. But now, a similar sort of ethical straw man is the righteous moralist. And the righteous moralist says whatever a company's home country standards are, those are the standards we follow in all countries. Well, here's the problem with this. First of all, it makes the same erroneous assumption. This assumption that ethics can change at the border. All right? They don't. Ethics should be common around the world. The other erroneous assumption it makes is that your ethical standards are better than anybody else's. All right? I perceive this as a sort of cultural imperialism, and that's not the way we want to approach ethics. Now, the reason I have a picture of Intel down here is Intel has a philosophy called copy exact when it comes to building their fabs, their fabricating, their factories, right? And it makes sense from gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? It makes sense from an efficiency standpoint in terms of manufacturing and processes. But every once in a while, I noticed when I was there that this copy exact philosophy went into employment practices and ethics and standards of behavior. And that's an example of the righteous moralist kind of taking the wrong direction. And then the final one is the naive immoralist. The naive immoralist says if a practice is common among other companies in that country, then the practice is just fine, right? So it's like the old saying in America with your mother saying, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you? So the idea with the naive immoralist is, well, all these other companies are doing this, say engaging in bribes. Therefore, we can engage in bribes because there's a critical mass and the majority define ethics. And that's not the case, okay? Now, there's a reason we really want to think about these things, all right? There are a lot of issues that come into play when it comes to international business. The first one is employment practices. How are we going to treat our employees? What rights are we going to allow our employees? That sounds kind of pretentious, doesn't it? Allow employees' rights? No, let's rephrase that. What rights are we going to recognize and defend, right? How are we going to pay? What kind of benefits are we going to, provide and so forth? What kind of working conditions are we going to provide? These are important ethical decisions that we need to make. Another one is human rights. How are we going to respond to human rights issues around the world? Are we going to refuse to do business in these countries? Are we going to try to make change internally? So do business within the country, but then try to bring about change? What human rights are we going to defend? What human rights are we going to support and champion? We also want to look at environmental concerns. We've got different laws, rules, and regulations all around the world. So, pretty easy to exploit countries that have fewer laws, rules, and regulations around environmental practices. Are we going to exploit those, or are we going to take a higher ethical road in these areas? But the one that you are going to run in most commonly and most immediately are ethical concerns around corruption, okay? If you start working in international business tomorrow, you may run into some environmental concerns, maybe some human rights and employment, maybe. But I guarantee you that the issue of corruption is going to step up to your front doorstep pretty darn quickly. So, to explore this a little more deeply, I've invited David Dayton to join us and give us a little insight. So, let's jump right into that. I think what I'd like to do to start out is just ask you to introduce yourself to everyone so we can get a little insight into who you are.
Great. I'm David Dayton. I recently graduated with a PhD in anthropology. I focus specifically on Chinese corporate cultures. And my dissertation work for the last 3 years was done in Thailand. So I looked at both small and to medium-sized Chinese enterprises and large MNCs from China that were working in Thailand and compared the corporate cultures and their adaptation to businesses there. So my background prior to the education was professional. I worked in China and Thailand and Taiwan for about 20 years. I speak Thai, I speak Mandarin, and I've been going to school and working there for 30 plus years now.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, then I have a feeling that we're going to have a great conversation because today we're talking about corporate corruption, bribery, things of that nature, and so forth. And I understand you have some insights there, but to kind of start things off, I want to tell a little story. So back early in my career, I was working for a small community newspaper, and we would design the newspaper and then send it off to printers, and they would take care of it there. And the printer, one time, we were putting together a special issue, and the printer said, "Hey, you know what? We have some jazz tickets we'd love to send over to you. You and your son can go off and go see a jazz game." Now, to be honest, I didn't accept them, not because of the sort of bribery aspect, because I just wasn't interested in basketball. But later, as I worked on my MBA and so forth, I started to think about that and think, oh, you know what? When companies and corporations say we don't accept bribes, we don't accept gifts and things of that nature, I thought, okay, yeah, that's what they're talking about. So when we're talking about bribes, gifts, corruption, and so forth, that's the sort of thing we're referring to, right?
Well, that's definitely a part of it. And I think that that's probably a really common part, particularly here in the United States. It's kind of above board. It's kind of a public issuance of something like tickets that allows people to participate in something that maybe is a couple $100, maybe a few $100 involved in something like that. But in China and Thailand in particular, in countries that are very, very low on the transparency index, meaning that there's a high level of systemic corruption across the board, it's significantly different. So you're looking at everything from collusion with different suppliers to sub-supplying out and not telling their clients what's going on. You're looking at kickbacks to QC and to order personnel inside your own office. Dinners and jazz games, or the equivalent thereof, often include prostitution and nights out and hotel rooms and stuff like that, not to mention literal boxes and envelopes of cash going back and forth between people. And that is just what happens between government officials and factories. What happens between clients is that and more as well, because the relationships become tight and personal and regular and consistent. And when you have a system that really isn't transparent, there's really no way to stop any of this, particularly when the system like China and Thailand are so inefficient.
So, okay, all right, that's eye-opening, right? Now, of course, China and Thailand, they're not neophytes in the world economy, and we trade with them on a regular basis and so forth. Surely there are laws on the books in China, for instance, that say this sort of behavior is illegal, unethical. What
Yeah,
am I missing
absolutely.
there?
No, you're absolutely correct about that. And China prides itself particularly on stating things like, we have some of the strictest laws on the book against anti-corruption and against environmental degradation and stuff like that. And so they're very proactive in writing laws. The problem comes in enforcement. When you've got multiple bureaucratic systems in China, for example, you've got the party system, then you've got a mere bureaucratic system. And so you've got multiple decision makers and multiple people of influence in a system that doesn't have a rule of law, or has a rule of law that's only been established really since the 1990s. And what that means is not just that they're unfamiliar with the rule of law, but they didn't have judges. They didn't have court precedent. They didn't have legal enforcement measures outside of police jurisdictions that allowed them to go after any type of corporate maleficence or malfeasance or anything like that, right? So it's really an unfamiliar but also unregulatable area for a significant amount of time in China's recent capitalist history. Now it's getting better. They're starting to enforce some things around corruption, particularly in the party. Mostly that's a control mechanism, but it's certainly having an effect on how things are done. But still, China's huge. It's the second biggest economy on the planet. You're looking at 1 billion, 0.3, 0.4, whosever numbers you believe, people. And, you've got so much unregulated, unknown, and opaque industry going on that it's still almost impossible just to keep up with all of the things that are going on. And the size is what allows for so much corruption to just continue throughout the system and working in China, even though they do, like you said, they've got some legal stuff.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yes, I had always kind of understood that there's a difference between having laws on the books versus enforcing those laws, and they're really two different mechanisms, right? One needs the other, but yeah. So
a good point on that too is that it's not just having laws on the books and the enforcement of those laws, but it's the idea of the rule of law versus the rule by law. So the rule of law means that everybody under the law is treated the same way, regardless of who you are. And that's the ideal in the West, right? Now, maybe we don't always live up to that, but that's pretty much the standard that you can be assured of. The way that it works in China is that it's ruled by law, meaning that those who are in power can use the law to benefit themselves or their cronies or their people that they're involved with, and they can use the law to attack other people. So you'll often find that people are put in jail for some really vague or generalized accusation that doesn't necessarily have any specific legal basis, but it's just a general overarching term. People get arrested for things with a general overturn because there's someone in power that's using a law to specifically take care of a situation or a person that they don't like, that doesn't benefit them.
I'd never thought about that. That's a powerful idea, the rule of law versus rule by law. And that kind of makes sense given, in the United States, we follow a common law system, whereas in China, they follow a civil law sort of system. And yes, judges play a completely different role there. And I can see that playing into what you're talking about. Well, then let me ask you this. So, as you know, I used to work for Intel Corporation, and talking about laws, right, which are different than ethics, but still, let's stay on laws for a moment. I'm going to read directly from Intel Corporation's Code of Ethics. And it says specifically, we do not violate the law and don't support others to violate the law either. This includes violating laws regarding bribery and corruption. So if I'm a Intel employee or a student who's going on to join Intel, can't I just kind of make the fundamental decision that I'm going to follow this code of ethics and I will not participate in any form of corruption that violates the law?
I think that you can make that decision. The difficulty is going to come then in how you and your corporation decide you're going to fulfill that decision, how you're going to live that decision afterwards. So if you're in an environment where corruption isn't necessarily a problem, where you can compete on a relatively level playing field, you can make that kind of decision, and you can pretty much guarantee that even if other people aren't making that decision, they're not going to have a significant advantage over you because the playing field is fairly level, and you've got enforcement and regulation that keep the cheaters, that keep those people that aren't making that same ethical decision out of competition, at least for the long term. Now, there's people going to pop up, obviously, in individual cases. The problem with working in an environment that's systemically corrupt is that you don't have that guarantee of a level playing field. And if you decide to participate, or if you decide to say, I'm going to be 100% ethical and I'm not going to participate in any type of corruption, that's fantastic. And that's where you should be. But you have to realize that that's going to limit your ability to do types of business. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that you've got to decide on a specific level of corruption that you're going to tolerate, and how you're going to go about doing that. What I'm really saying is that as an employer, as a student who's going over there as an internship, or you're learning how to do something, you've got to have open and clear communication with your company. Your company, let's say that if it's a company that's been there already, they've got established practices. Now, if it's a company that's new, maybe you're the one that has to establish the practices, and you might have to go and feel out exactly what's acceptable and what isn't for you, both legally in the United States in terms of the IRS, in terms of Corrupt Practices Act and things like that, but also ethically in terms of your own standards and what you're going to allow in your corporation. But the other real part about it is figuring out how you're going to compete in that environment. A couple of strategies that corporations and small companies use when they're over there that I've seen that are really quite common. Probably for most large corporations, they do set a standard of non-tolerance, and they do not let any of their employees, secretaries, sellers, QC people, QA, any C-level folks get involved in specific negotiations or in specific transactions that would violate either their specific roles and responsibilities or any type of the company's ethics. And they'll have enforcement internally that allow for that. What they do to get around that, or what they do to facilitate business there, let me say, is that they oftentimes hire consultants with just exorbitantly large salaries. And that individual salary paid to a consulting individual or a consulting firm is expected, but not explicitly stated, to then pay for whatever needs to be done to allow business to go forth so that the corporation has plausible deniability. When I owned my business in Shenzhen, we had the standard that we weren't going to accept any corruption, and we really strive to do that. And one of the things that happened is when we bought and remodeled a new office in downtown Shenzhen, we had to pay for we had to have the safety inspection guy from the city come in. The safety inspection guy would not come to our office for anything less than $15,000 US in cash in an envelope before he showed up. We just weren't going to do that. That was just not something that we could justify doing. We negotiated, we worked in, we did everything we could. We got him down to about $6,000 or $7,000, and we still thought this is too much. We don't want to just pay for this. Now, I think that the Corrupt Practices Act says you can't pay for services to be rendered that otherwise would be legally done without any payments, but that you can provide some kind of tip or favor afterwards for services that are rendered efficiently. And so we're saying, can we pay him afterwards? Can we figure out something? And we just couldn't figure anything out. One lady in our office came to us and said, hey, I know his niece and she's getting married. They're from my same hometown. So we pitched this guy. Can we do something else? Can we provide some type of gift to your niece afterwards, after you've already done our service? Because these two people are friends. They know each other. Now, that may be a justification. That may be a kind of working around the rules. But these types of relationships and these types of negotiations happen not just infrequently when you're setting up an office, not just infrequently when you've got some, massive new virus that's coming out. These things happen on a daily basis for orders from 10 to 100 to millions of dollars.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. So that makes me think, okay, so you're going to run into these sort of systematic practices, right? They're not the strange little one-offs that you run into now and again. They're not transparent. They're not above board. You're going to run into these systematic issues. You needed the site up and running. You needed to find a way to get the inspector out there, and you needed to find a way to make all that happen without going against your established code of ethics. That's tricky.
Yeah.
Right. What can an up and coming student or executive decide right now? What kind of strategies can they put in place to help them navigate these waters when they come up against them? Because it sounds like they're going to come up against these. Figure out what you're going to do now versus at the moment. You mentioned some strategies earlier. You mentioned making sure you're in constant communication with the company and so forth. What kind of strategies can a company or a new employee put in place to help them navigate these waters when they come into play?
Let me just start off by saying that the strategy that you don't want is blindness, whether willfully or just out of complete ignorance on your own. Um, we had I had a friend who was a C-level employee of a large technology company based in Utah that was doing a lot of electronics manufacturing in Shenzhen. And we were doing some work both for his company and for other clients, some of the same suppliers that he was using. And he would on a regular basis just tell me flat out, our company is so committed to ethics that nobody in our company in China is doing anything illegal. Nobody participates in any type of corruption. And he was, I believe he was sincere about this. He really didn't think that anybody in his company was doing anything wrong. And we were working with his company, we were working with his suppliers, and we knew otherwise. And it wasn't my place to point anything out. I spoke with other people to try to not go against him directly or anything like that, because he was a friend of mine. But that type of ignorance is a conscious strategy. I mean, he wasn't a dumb guy. He had been in China for a number of years. He didn't speak Chinese, but he had been there for long enough, and he had been doing manufacturing around the world for long enough that he knew that there were things that were going on, and he just chose not to see it. And if you choose not to see it, you can sail through China. And there are a lot of people that choose not to see what's going on. Or there are a lot of companies, like I said, that will hire a specific consultant, and they give them a ton of money and they don't ask any questions. Don't ask, don't tell is another form of this type of blindness or ignorance. Those are both surprisingly very common strategies. If that is good enough for you, that is a plausible level of deniability that maybe you're going to accept. For a lot of other people, particularly if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise and you're hands-on and you're working with a lot of the contracts and the negotiations and the problem solving and the everyday order processing that where's all these kickbacks and all these bribery and everything else happens, you have to figure out what you're going to do. Legally, the US says you can do some things and you can't do other things. And my practice when I was there and what I've seen other people do is that you exploit the as much as I can do legally in the United States area of it. And then you completely disassociate yourself from any others. Oftentimes you'll just have to set a bar and say, if it gets to the point of prostitution, we're just not going to have anything involved with it. But that's just off limits, period. If you go to karaoke and clothes start coming off, you leave instantly. And that's just the bottom line, right? Doesn't matter if it hurts the relationship or not. You've got to be able to explain to yourself, to maybe your spouse, to your stakeholders, to a potential audit from the United States. Look, we check out at this point, right? And those are some of the strategies that I think that are really necessary, that you have to recognize. It's not just jazz tickets, but there are significant moral issues involved with doing business in places that are non-transparent. And this isn't to say that, oh my gosh, China's really bad and the US isn't. It's to say that this happens in both places, but you're going to run into it on a regular basis, in some places more than others.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. We're focusing on China just because China and Taiwan, that's your area of expertise and so forth. We're not sitting here lambasting China, and we're not saying that the US is on the high horse of,
not at all,
virtue
Bernie Madoff and every other Enron scandal should tell you that not only can the US be involved in corruption, but we do it at a world-class level.
What a wonderful thought to go out on. Hey,
USA.
USA. Hey, David, this has been absolutely tremendous. I appreciate your time and lending your expertise in what is quite frankly a terrifying area when I really think about it. But it's important to factor this in if you're going to do business globally.
Yeah, good to talk with you. And that's just it. It can be terrifying if you're not prepared. And that probably is the most important strategy. Make sure you understand the environment that you're going into. Make sure that you know who the people are that you're working with, both in your own corporation and in the government and your suppliers and vendors and whatnot. And at that point, you don't have to be as scared. You've got a strategy, you've got some ideas, and hopefully that's helpful.
Now that's a note to go out on. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
You bet. Good to talk to you.
So we've explored ethics, but now laws and regulations are different. So let's look at laws and regulations a little bit. Now, the thing about laws and regulations is they're different everywhere. Everywhere. Okay? However, there are kind of three main systems that you're going to run into. You're going to run into common law. Here's my cursor right there. Common law is practiced in countries like England, the United States, Australia, Canada, India. It actually really started in England, and check this out. All of these places were once English colonies, right? So it continues on. However, we also have civil law practiced in much of South America and Asia and many of the African countries. And then we have Islamic law, practiced very strongly in Saudi Arabia and to some degree or another in most other Middle Eastern countries. So what does this mean for us in international business? Well, let's explore. Let's first define common law. Common law is based on precedents set by past judges as they interpret codified statutes. Their rulings are then constitute law. So here's the idea. All right, so there are some codified statutes, actually written laws out there. And every time somebody brings a case before a judge, the judge reads that law and interprets the law for that case. And then the ruling becomes law. That is the new law. And then through the ages, and I mean ages, judge after judge after judge reads all the preceding rulings, understands what the precedent set by those rulings are, and then adheres to the precedent when making future rulings. So most of the laws on the books, when it comes to common law, most of the laws on the books are not on the books because a legislature put it on the books. It's because it's been established through decades and decades, and in some cases centuries, of common law precedent established by the judges. Okay? So that's common law. But then you have civil law. All right? Civil law is when a legislation passed in a legislature, more prescriptive in nature, often enforced by regulatory agencies empowered with enforcing the statutory law. Now, this means that just about every law on the books was written by a lawmaker, established, and then a regulatory agency is then put in place to enforce those laws. In a civil law system, judges do not have anywhere near the same power as they do in a common law system, because you're not establishing and maintaining precedent all through the ages. Now, the common law system, such as that seen in England or the United States, obviously they have a legislature of some sort, right? And they have regulatory agencies. So, for example, in the United States, we have a regulatory agency called the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and they're responsible for enforcing laws around the environment. Now, in that case, it smacks of civil law. However, you can still take the EPA to court and have judges evaluate and challenge the regulations set by the EPA. So common law still wins out. Okay, so then we have Islamic law, sometimes called Sharia law, all right? The religious law of Islam viewed as God's commandments for Muslims. It constitutes a system of duties that are incumbent upon Muslims by virtue of their religious belief. Now, before you start saying, oh, religion, that has no place in law and separation of church and state if you're American and so forth, get over yourself, all right? So In the United States, for example, we are predominantly a Judeo-Christian country, which means the vast majority of our laws, my friend, are founded in Judeo-Christian principles. So all Islamic law is doing is saying, yeah, we found our laws in religious principles as well. They just simply happen to be Islamic principles, okay? However, they're just much more grounded in their holy writings, the Quran, than say like American laws may be grounded in the Bible. But I'm telling you, folks, they still quote the Bible on the floor of the legislature all over this country. So while the Bible has huge influence in the United States, the Quran has huge influence in places like Saudi Arabia, although to a much greater extent. Saudi Arabia, as we've talked about in a previous video, is a theocracy, and the Quran is literally their constitution. So it's the same but different. Okay, so let's talk about what does this mean for us in terms of doing international business. Well, let's first look at rigidity, right? Laws tend to be much more rigid in a civil system, right? Much more prescriptive, whereas in common law, it's just more of a guidance, right? So if you're setting up contracts, which we'll talk about here in a moment, in a civil system, in a civil law system, your contracts have better be detailed, right? We'll come back to that. Judges, the role of judges. If you are doing business in, say, the United States or in Australia or England where they practice common law, and you have issue with a law or you feel that you've been wronged by some party, you can take them to court, bring suit against them, and a judge can hear your case and figure out what to do based on precedent. If you're doing business in a civil-based system, you are not going to have the same recourse available to you as in a common law system. So whatever is written down in civil law is what the law says. The law says what the law says. So you need to really understand the law before you start engaging in business in these cases. All right. Let's look at contracts, right? I told you we were going to come back to this. Business contracts tend to be more detailed and specific in civil law countries. You need to be really specific because whatever's written in that contract is going to hold up in court because they really can't, stray too far from that. So trying to account for every possible contingency, whereas contracts in common law countries tend to be shorter and less specific. So for example, when I set up a contract, a business partnership with my business partner, we set up, I think it was like a 3-page contract, and it was really, really broad and really general. And that's normal in a common law system. In Islamic law, the terms and conditions of a joint venture contract should be drafted in such a way as to avoid any possible dispute during the conduct of business or at the time sharing profits or bearing the loss. Islamic law really likes things clear so that there is as little opportunity for conflict as possible. Okay, very important. Now, when it comes to ownership and agreement, such as owning land or coming to agreements in terms of how you're going to share equipment and so forth, common law countries, ownership is established by use, right? So there's a saying in the U.S., I don't know if it's true, but you hear it a lot that says possession is 9/10 of the law. Possession is 9/10 of the law. I don't know what that means, but it basically says if you're having it and using it, it's yours, right? Whereas in civil law countries, ownership has to be registered with the state. If you own an entity, or if you own a contract, or if you own equipment, or if you own a relationship, and so on and so forth, you need to register that with the state, because if there comes a time where the ownership of that is challenged by somebody, the state is going to go with whatever is established. This means that civil law countries, it is important to register ownership agreements to be enforceable, while in common law countries, as long as proof of the agreement can be provided, even a simple verbal agreement, then that agreement is binding. Yeah, in a common law country, verbal agreement is binding. Whereas in a civil law, they're like, verbal agreement, I don't see a record of that in my filing system. In Islamic law, business capital should be delivered in the form of money. Okay, so what do I mean? If you're joining a joint venture, or if you're doing a partnership or something like that, some people bring skills, some people bring equipment, some people bring networks, some people bring expertise, right? Well, you need to quantify all this in money. If a partner is joining a business venture with an existing business, commodities or properties, the value of these assets should be valuated in terms of money, okay? That way, if any disputes arise, we know exactly what monetary value we placed on all of these assets, and things can be divided accordingly. All right. Other practical concerns when it comes to Islamic law, by the way, no, you can't charge or pay interest. So financing is done entirely differently under Islamic law. Now, if you're sitting here going, well, how do you get loans or buy assets or things like that if you can't take out a loan and charge or pay interest? Trust me, there's a bazillion ways that you can take out a loan and still not have to pay interest in the traditional sense of how you and I may understand interest. Just because it is the way that we do it doesn't mean it's the only way. They consider interest to be exploitative, and so it's completely unavailable. It's prohibited. There's the word I'm looking for, prohibited. Also, you're not going to do business or invest in companies dealing with alcohol or gambling. Alcohol and gambling is strictly prohibited, and so you do not do business with or invest in companies that practice those business endeavors, okay? So, bam, there you go. Big lecture today, but I hope it gave you some insight and some tools for how to be successful going forward. Stick with us. We're almost done. We're at the home stretch. We'll see you again soon. Until then, have a fantastic day.